workshops there and given readings there.
On your writing or to do your writing.
So are you ready? Imani's mood. And remind themselves, I can do this, I just have to persevere.
This is a literary magazine that students produce.
Thank you so much for coming.
There's just levels of developmental appropriateness. So
came from the idea that, the more pride celebrations I go to, the more kids.
And then you have this great research on the ground. Some young lady who was a research librarian who sent.
My name is Kevin Ferns. I teach English at Woodland Community College, and I'd like to introduce our two speakers today. And then I'm going to let them moderate as they have something prepared, I think, and then they'll probably be ready to answer your questions as well. So first, we have Christian Kiefer, who's an active poet, songwriter, recording artist, and author. When Christian Kiefer's father told him that everyone hates his job, adding, except maybe astronauts, it stuck with him. As he set out to write his debut novel, The Infinite Tides, characters kept bubbling to the surface, none so intriguing as a depressed astronaut. Keith Corcoran, the astronaut in question, is revered in his field, a mathematical genius and a brilliant engineer, but his otherworldly talents do nothing to prepare him for the tragedy that befalls his family or its irrevocable outcomes. After a 6-month mission on the International Space Station, Keith returns to a house that has already ceased to be a home, emptied almost entirely of furniture and the people he loves. It is here that Keith tries to make sense of the ghosts, the memories, and the feelings that he can barely acknowledge. And Michael Spurgeon is the author of 2 short collections of poems, Valente's Delicate Wrist and Prosthetic Breath and Other Poems. He is co-founder and board president of 916 Inc., a Sacramento area nonprofit dedicated to promoting children's literacy through creative writing. Let the Water Hold Me Down is Michael's first novel. Still reeling from the loss of his family in an accident that he feels responsible for causing, Hank Singer accepts an invitation to move to the isolated and beautiful state of Chiapas. There, in the streets and cafes of Colonial City, nestled in the mountain forests, he settles into the semblance of a new life under the watchful eye of his best friend and former college roommate, Cesar, the charismatic heir to one of Mexico's most powerful families. But when an army of impoverished Indians calling themselves Zapatistas emerges from the jungle to seize half the state, Hank finds himself a foreigner trapped in someone else's war. The repercussions of the decisions he makes, and does not make, threaten to shatter both his friendship and the renewed life he has found in the Mexican highlands. And with that, I'll turn it over to you both.
They both sound like bummers. Depressing bummer books. We had thought we would just read maybe 5 minutes apiece, just to give you some indication of what the language is like in the books and a little flavor. Michael's book is available downstairs at the Ad Lumen press table, which is being manned by myself and other Ad Lumen writers and volunteers. It's a small press that we run out of American River College. And my book, The Infinite Tides, is at the giant pile of books, the Barnes & Noble pile of books, which is what I call it. I'm just going to read you the very beginning, which acts sort of as a prologue, and it'll give you some indication as to what the book sounds like. The book is not always as highfalutin as the beginning bits, but this will give you some indication as to the attention to language and the musicality of the sentences, which is something that I paid a lot of attention to. And in fact, as a writer, I pay more attention to that than I do plot and character, which I have to think about almost after the fact, because I'm very concerned with the way the language works in the text. At some point we should talk about the animals, which is a very different kind of thing. This is how the book starts, and it is about an astronaut who gets derailed from his life. The airlock opened. He knew there would be no perceptible change in pressure, but now that the moment had arrived, he somehow expected the transition of atmosphere to be audible, for the brief symphony of thumps and clicks between the shuttle and the docking node to include the hiss or shush or sigh of oxygen exchange. And yet, despite the absence of such a marker, the swing of the hatch felt to Keith like a sudden outrushing of the tide. a sensation that remained with him as he floated through the opening and entered the harmony module, where the crew they had come to relieve all smiled expectantly back at him. It was a moment as glorious and transcendent as any he could have imagined, and he would realize only later that it represented the single coordinate point in which he understood that he had done it, that at last he had entered the long, incredible upward-turning arc that had been the trajectory of his life, and that he was, finally and undeniably, an astronaut. In the days to follow, he would try to describe the experience, but what words were there for such a moment? He thought first of numbers, not of words, but then he always had. The seemingly infinite parallels that extended off the edges of the grid forever in their ongoing X and Y coordinates had finally intersected on some Z plane that he had thought about since his earliest days, and yet had never been able to truly understand or plot or calculate. He had stared at it through the window of the shuttle on their approach, the interconnected tubes and the fanning wings of the solar arrays stretching out like some magnificent metal flower above the blue swirl of Earth. And even then he was thinking of the numbers, the average speed of 17,239 miles per hour in an orbit very nearly that of a perfect circle, the apogee and perigee perhaps 10 kilometers in difference and inclining to 51.6459 degrees, the angle of its motion, the angle of its helix to continuance. The feeling of weightlessness itself so familiar and comfortable, it was as if he had lived within that condition for the entirety of his life, and in many ways he had. He would ask himself if this had been his destiny, and each time he would answer yes. He would answer yes, 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 as if the weightlessness of his body was itself the vindication and proof that a life spent huddled over paper scratched through with the symbology of mathematics had indeed been the true vector. The numbers themselves extant in a universe that was this universe and no other, days and nights spinning past in 45-minute increments, continents and oceans and weather patterns unscrolling under the round porthole windows, the lit webwork of cities and roads on the black sphere of the planet below, and the flow of the numbers, his numbers, in everything, always. In his memory, that moment of passing through the hatch would resolve itself into an unambiguous image of triumph, but there had been something else as well, a sensation so fast and intense and so quickly gone again that it had been easy to forget. There had been that feeling of pride, the rush of his success, of all the years of his labor coalescing into this finally solved equation. But for one instant, there had also been the clutch of an impossible helplessness so complete and staggering that it seemed to seize at his heart. A flicker and then gone. In its wake, only the after-echo of a distant high-pitched ringing that vibrated through him even as it returned to silence once again, as he stared into the smiling faces of the crew and told himself that yes, he was meant to be here, that it had been his destiny to succeed, and so he had succeeded. A sense of panic already replaced by the pride of his accomplishment, replaced so completely that he would not remember that flicker, would not allow himself to remember, even after everything else had happened. In his memory of that moment, he was an astronaut, and they were welcoming him aboard the space station, and in his memory, he was smiling. Is this not what he was meant to do? Is the answer not as fixed and indisputable as any equation he might have been tasked to solve? Watch them now, the numbers as if stretched upon a wire, the sixes stacked astride the decimal, the 7 and 3 and zeros behind them. Study them all your days, and then ask yourself how any such equation could describe anything at all. The water rushing across the sand, the tiny stars, the way her hand curled into his. They could not even describe the way he felt about the numbers themselves, what they had meant to him, what they would continue to mean. Such equations to imagine. Now watch them vanish into the spiraled lemniscate of what is to come. This, the black firmament, this the dark matter flowing into and out of your heart. So it's just a laugh a minute. Every page, comedy.
I love that, though. It's exquisite.
I think maybe Michael, well, you should read, and then we'll talk.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm really jealous of Christian because he's got that prologue that he can read, and I'm always
But you're taller than me, so it makes up for it.
I've got that going for me. So the book takes place in Chiapas, Mexico, during the 1994 Zapatista uprising. I was actually living there during the event. And the central character is a gringo, and he's had a conflict and has been told he should leave Mexico, but is not doing that. Is in fact returning to confront his friend. So I'll read this couple of paragraphs. From Tuxtla, the road to San Cristobal de las Casas rises 2,300 meters in 82 steep kilometers, and as the taxi traversed up the narrow switchbacks, the valley floor fell away so that I could see far out across the plain. I watched the arid landscape through my own battered reflection in the window and tried to calculate how much of a head start Cesar and Ramon had in getting back to the house and Maria. It was hard to gauge how long I had been unconscious in that ditch, but I didn't think it had been more than a few minutes. It just didn't seem like the afternoon had progressed very much. The stumble to the airport probably had taken 15 minutes, maybe 20, and I guessed I'd spent another 15 minutes or so at the airport. They'd probably had a 45-minute jump on me, maybe an hour. I hoped it wasn't more than that. Of course, he'd left those other assholes with her when he and Ramon hauled me to the airport. But even if those guys had done nothing in Cesar's absence, an hour was plenty of time for Cesar to do something terrible. I tried not to think what those various terrible things might be. I even tried to convince myself that Cesar would come to his senses and let her go, but I didn't believe it. So I thought about what I was going to do, what I would do, and what I might have to do, and whether I'd have the nerve. Suddenly I realized that I actually was going to do something. I didn't know what it was, but I was going to do something, and all at once I wondered if I'd ever really made a choice that mattered in my entire life. My college had been the only one to offer a scholarship. I hadn't chosen Jen so much as found her, and really she'd found me. I'd been the one who hadn't known where his life was going. I'd been the one who needed finding. Her father gave me the job. I hadn't earned it. It wasn't something I'd worked for or particularly wanted. Even Susie had been unplanned. My God, Susie, my little girl in that water. There's no denying I'd chosen to go down the rapids, but I hadn't understood the choice. I should have, but I hadn't. Coming to New Mexico hadn't been a choice either. It'd just been me flailing around. And Maria, I didn't choose Maria. The conflict in those few days when we'd been sequestered in the compound had done that. And I sure as hell hadn't chosen to take sides in the Zapatista conflict. And right then, sitting in the taxi, it seemed so obvious which side was right and which was wrong. How had I failed to choose? People chose sides about something important, something that was meant to shape the whole world and how people live in it. And what did I do? I poured drinks in a bar. Men and women and children were being pushed right up against the edge, and they rose up, and some of them with nothing more than sticks, some of them with nothing more than their voices. Ya basta, they said. Ya basta. What did I do? I fed them a few pans of leftover lasagna, and I had to be talked into doing that. The taxi continued to climb into the mountains, and the view changed from the dry plain to the narrow valleys, from scrublands to leafier tropical vegetation. We climbed and rose from one deciduous zone to the next, and the vines and lush foliage gave way to a pine forest. The driver turned off the air conditioner and rolled down his window. The air was cool. We climbed and passed into a fog. The world became ethereal. The forest shrouded, dripping with mist. The fog thickened and the taxi slowed. Everything disappeared in the whiteness, only the yellow lines rising up from the vanished road to delineate direction. My reflection in the window grew ghost-like. I looked at my image and at the white nothingness that masked it. Who was the person I saw there? The rumor was that Subcomandante Marcos first arrived in Chiapas in 1983. The man I'd seen in the Zocalo definitely wasn't Indian, and he couldn't have been older than 35 or 40, which meant he was about my age when he hiked into the jungle from wherever he'd come and started organizing. He had chosen. He had come to Chiapas, and he'd seen what was going on, and he put on a mask, and he did something. Salvador had done something too. So had Antonio. And me, I'd seen it too, but I was a tourist. I was like the Thompsons. I was like that woman in the Zocalo worried about her reservations in Palenque. Christ, reservations in Palenque. I'd been so wrapped up in my own private pity party, my self-indulgent grief, my personal palenque, that I hadn't seen what was right in front of my face or tried to do anything about it. I could have done something. What had I done? Nothing. And by doing nothing, I had aligned myself with Caesar and his family and what they stood for: wealth and power and commerce over people. Maybe that's oversimplifying it. Not maybe. But maybe we have to simplify some things sometimes just so we can choose and act. In any case, I was choosing. I just wish I could have chosen sooner. I should have. Things would have turned out very differently.
So now we either sit in silence or talk to you and answer your questions. It's all up to you. You know, the microphone being so close to your mouth made me realize how attentive you were to the word choices, and particularly those hard consonant P sounds in that, you know, close to that last sentence that you read, when the protagonist is so frustrated and talking in that very frustrated, self-defeated, self-critical voice. And the bio mentioned that, you know, your earlier poetry volumes, and I just wondered, as a writer, how conscious you are of doing that kind of move.
So my classical training actually is in creative writing poetry, and I'm certainly trying to be conscious of the musicality on the page. You know, I believe in trying to cast a spell upon the reader. And, you know, I think it was Gabriel Garcia Marquez who said, you know, it takes a lot of screws and nails and different things to keep the carpentry of the piece together so that you can keep the reader in the spell. And certainly, you know, your work does that. I mean, you're dropping the spiraled lemniscate of what is to come, right? You know,
it's important to drop the lemniscate.
Yeah, to drop the nouns.
I just think I'd like to have you each talk a little bit to the contrast between focusing on the language compared to either the character and or the plot, which seem to be kind of the ways that a lot of novelists do go.
Yeah, so for me, I read sentences first, and sometimes I don't even really notice the plot, which I know sounds just ridiculous, but Michael read Light in August maybe 2-3 years ago for the first time, and it's a you know, this is like Faulkner and Hemingway having a, you know, like, you know,
sort of,
yeah, like the talentless Faulkner and Hemingway. And you know, he comes to me and he goes like, okay, look, so like this book has 2 plot lines and they don't even come together. And I said, it does? You know, and I've read it like 15 times, you know, but you know, I can almost recite the first page of that book from memory, you know, because it's the fluidity and the cadence of Faulkner's sentences. I mean, Sound of the Fury, the Dilsey chapter, April 8th, 1928, the day dawned bleak and chill, a moving rain out of the southeast which, instead of precipitating into moisture, manifested itself in minute and venomous particles, which, comma, as Dilsey opened the cabin door and emerged, needled laterally into her flesh, period. Like, that is a great sentence, you know? It's a sentence so great that I didn't try to memorize it, I just read it so many times. And when I was working on this book in particular, I carried Faulkner's Absalom, Absalom with me, which has, I think, the best opening sentence of any book ever, which is so long I'll never be able to memorize it. But when I was writing, sometimes, and this is a dysfunction of my method, like when I'm writing and it seems to be going fast, like when people are talking and they get up and they do stuff, like I feel like I'm doing it wrong then. Because this book in particular, I wanted it to be very still, and I was completely obsessed with the way the sentences could slow down the action, which is the opposite of what you should actually do. You should want the stuff to roll, you know. so I'm a huge fan of the Swedish filmmaker Ingmar Bergman, and a lot of this book takes place in American cul-de-sac in a suburb. And I kept thinking, like, what if Bergman had made a film that took place in the American suburbs with all the cul-de-sacs and the Home Depot and the Starbucks and all of that thing looking the same? What would it feel like? And how could I put that in 2 sentences? And that was the obsessiveness of the musicality. For the book I have coming out in March, I wanted it to be equally beautiful, but I wanted it to move, like from page 1, to see if I could do it. To see if, like, maybe this is all I can do. Because I'll tell you, I can write a guy eating a bowl of cereal, looking out the window at the neighbor's house, which happens a lot in this book. I can write that for days. Days. But, like...
It's really beautiful when he's doing it, though, I gotta say.
But, like, the next book, there's, like, guns and cocaine, and, like, they rob places. Like, stuff happens, and that stuff, to me, is, like, agonizingly hard to write, because I've got to get... My sentences have to get out of the way then, So sometimes I just overwrite it, and then I just comb out on the draft. I just, like, pull everything I can. So I have the beauty, but it still moves, And that, for me, is the big balancing act. Michael's book has a different problem, which you'll talk about, which is its first person, which is going to limit what he can do.
Yeah. So this book, first person, the narrator's a 29-year-old, college-educated gringo who's had some trauma in his life, but sort of in his recent life, but otherwise has had a fairly unremarkable life. And so it took, between first draft and final draft, it took 10 years. And, it was a lot of, I'd wrote a draft and I'd send it out, or it'd come back and I'd put it in a drawer and just leave it alone. It wasn't like I was working on it straight for 10 years. I'd work on other stuff. And one of the things that happens is you're stuck with this voice, which, when I started, I was 33, so the 29-year-old voice didn't bother me so much. By the time I was finished, though, I was 43, and I was a little tired of this upstart. So that's one challenge. And you're stuck with the vocabulary of the character. So there's that issue. I don't know, like, my process for this book, getting the first draft down, I was really sort of deadline driven. I'd given myself, I'd moved my family to southern Mexico. My wife is from southern Mexico, and we decided to move close to her family, live cheaply, and I would have 6 months to write this book. And so I got down there and started writing, and I was like, it was all about the deadline. And so my process was every morning I'd get up, have a cup of coffee. We'd rented this house that had a little bungalow in back, and I'd go out to the bungalow, and I'd start by writing a postcard to my brother, telling him sort of what my plan was for the day of writing. And I never, ever accomplished what I set out to accomplish according to the postcard, but I'd sit down and I'd try. So that was my warm-up, and then I'd write all day long. My wife would bring me lunch, and then she was off with the kids and her family. And I'd write till about 5. And I just did that every day, pushing to the end, pushing, which I think resulted in a deeply flawed first draft, but a complete first draft. And then it took a long time to sort of rework it and figure out what this character was about, and all of that took a lot of reworking.
Always does.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, I mean, he rewrites a new book every day. Like, it's ridiculous. So I guess currently I'm working on something, and every time I sit down to work on it, I sort of start at page 1 again, and it's also probably a terrible way to go about it. And I'm just going through. So, like, the first paragraph has been gone over, I don't know, 1,000 times maybe. And I still, every time I sit down to work on it, tinker with that first paragraph. It just can't seem to get right. And so, but it's certainly a question of music and like, what do I want in there, and how is that first paragraph setting us up for everything that follows, kind of thing.
Yeah, my character is a mathematician astronaut. I mean, he's really a mechanical engineer, but to himself, he's a mathematician first. Mechanical engineer because that's what you do if you join NASA as a mathematician, and for him anyway. And he is, I wanted to write about a totally type A job-focused, career-focused guy, which all astronauts are. You don't get there by accident. You work hard and you make it. And I wanted to write about that guy being derailed from his path. So the language of mathematics and numbers is the language that he knows best, and he actually lacks the language to talk about himself and his emotional state in any significant way. So when he's stressed out, he like analyzes the load-bearing walls in this room, or the curvature of the metal chair legs and their angles. Like, that's where his brain goes. He doesn't like think about, what is she going to say? What am I going to do? What are they going to do? He doesn't think that way. He just thinks, he wants everything to equate, and he's in a situation where things do not equate. And it is at heart a very simple metaphor for the whole novel. Life does not equate the way mathematics equates, but then also it does. And that's kind of the push and pull of the book, is him kind of on a linguistic level trying to find the language to deal with what's happening to him as a human being.
I would say that Christian's handling of math in the book too sort of results in sort of a poetry of mathematics. I mean, it's really, really gorgeous.
Thank you.
It's really pretty. So I went to Mexico when I was 23. I had a job. I'd been out of college for a year, and I had a job in San Francisco that I didn't like, but it paid pretty well, and so I'd saved up a little money. And on a whim, an old childhood friend of mine who just graduated from college said, "Oh, I want to move to Chile and write a book." And I thought, man, that sounds so much better than what I'm doing with my stupid job. But I said to him, and I knew nothing about the economics of Chile, but I said to him, that seems awfully far away. I don't have enough money. Like, if we got into trouble, how would I get back? But if you went someplace closer to like Mexico, I might do that. And he said, well, when could you leave? And I was like, what? Are you serious? And he's like, yeah. And I was like, I've got this job. I'd have to give 2 weeks notice. So he's like, so 3 weeks from now. And I was like, okay. And so, I mean, that's literally how it, I didn't buy a guidebook. I knew nothing about Mexico. It was totally a whim. And we ended up sort of wandering around Mexico for a while, and then we ended up in, I had never heard of San Cristobal de las Casas before I was getting on the bus to travel there. And, an all-day bus trip resulted in us getting to this town, and we both looked at each other and was like, this is the place we were looking for. And we ended up renting an apartment within 2 hours of being in town, and we were there. And then I just ended up meeting a woman that caught my eye, and I ended up getting a job bouncing in a bar. And so I was there. The idea had been to write, but I didn't have any idea really how to write at that point. I just had the ambition. And I didn't have that book in mind. And then the Zapatista uprising happened, and it started literally across the street from my house. And my wife, well, she's my wife now. She was the girl I was interested in then. Did feed Zapatistas lasagna on the first day of the conflict. That happened. So I was there, and when the conflict happened, and I was falling in love with this woman that was, I knew I was going to marry. I said, this is the stuff of the kind of fiction I'd like to write one day, and it's certainly the kind of fiction I like to read. I was a big, as he said, Hemingway fan, Graham Greene. I liked a lot of Graham Greene's work. So I recognized it, but I didn't really choose. And then when I did decide to sit down and write it, a decade afterwards, I said, well, who's my ideal reader? And I decided, in order to honor the person I was when I had lived through that, I was like, well, I want to write a book that I would have wanted to read when I was 23, going through all of that stuff. And so that's sort of what I did. I was like, my ideal reader is me at 23. Now, it's a terrible idea to write a book for, a 23-year-old male, because those people don't buy books. But that was sort of how I chose. And then the other way I chose was, so I've been married almost 20 years now to a Mayan Indian woman. Her family is all there. We go back every year. And I'm sort of deeply embedded in that culture. At the same time, though, I wanted to write about the Zapatista conflict and everything, sort of the socio-political issues going on around it. And as deeply buried as I am into that community, I really felt like, I'm still an outsider. And if I'm going to write about this, I have to write about it from the outsider's perspective. I just didn't feel like I had the right to take on the voice of an indigenous person, and nor did I really think I could do it with any sort of credibility. So those were it's got to be a first-person narrator because it's got to be an outsider. So those were my choices.
I wrote most of this book at a Starbucks in Rockland because I've got 6 children, and at the time I didn't have a place in the house that I could write without having food thrown at me. And it was right when the economic bubble burst, the real estate thing, and so there were a lot of men at the Starbucks looking for work in the paper every day. And I started to kind of take notes on my imaginary version of what their lives were like, oh, that guy was probably like that guy worked for a law firm or something, and eventually I thought, I might have a book in this, because Michael had written this and was revising it at the time, and that kind of got me burning on working on a book again, which I hadn't done for a while. And I had a lot of different men, and I was thinking, I'll write a book about men who lose their jobs, because men define themselves by their work. It's like the second thing we ask, what's your name? Oh, what do you do? And I thought, well, if we've got a whole group of men across the United States who have no work, then what becomes that self-defining principle? What do you do all day? Well, I sit at Starbucks and look at the paper, and I'm depressed, So eventually most of those characters burned off, but I knew I wanted an immigrant, and there's a prominent immigrant family in the book from Ukraine, and I knew I wanted somebody to be very successful, very type A, very career-oriented. And Keith Corcoran, the astronaut in the book, might well have been a stockbroker or something like that. But again, that Ingmar Bergman camera, I also thought, what would have happened if Ingmar Bergman made Star Wars or something? Like something with space and astronauts, and it's just so ready to put the kind of language that I wanted to write on space, and on orbits and those beautiful, clean, white spacecraft and everything. So I spent, a year on the NASA website trying to figure out how to do it. But it's way more interesting writing about astronauts than it is writing about stockbrokers, So it was really that. Yeah, we should talk about the editorial process some, because as you know, and maybe not many others do, you do a million drafts of your book, and you're and you give it to your friends, and they give you feedback, and you have hopefully honest friends who will give you honest feedback, and for me, that's this guy. I lie to him, but he tells me the truth. And then you, this is 41 drafts of this book altogether, 41 drafts, And my new book is I got 30 drafts on it, and I'm not even halfway done writing it. And that's just, that's a little of that is my dysfunctional process on how I do things, and the kinds of things that I'm paying attention to and not paying attention to. but you think you're done and you send it to your agent. Hopefully you get an agent. You send, and we can talk about that if you're interested. But you get an agent, and then your agent goes through it and wants some changes to be made because she's got to sell the thing. So you make some changes, and then you send it to your editor, and your editor might just gut the whole thing and want to rearrange it, or like change whole sections, or change the entire plot. Like, these things are all possible, and you've got to decide as a writer, like, what's reasonable, what will make your book better, and what's this guy misreading your work. So like, this book had edits on every single page, and I went through them very carefully, and I did the stuff I thought was reasonable, and I ranted and raved to my agent a lot because some of it was like, a line through a page, and he would write like, "This is just bad." And I'm like, "It's not, though. It's not bad. It's just not furthering the plot," which he could have written like, can we do this and make the plot move, But that's not his style, He's just like, cut, So there was a lot of ranting and raving. Michael had to listen to a lot of it too, God bless him. And then you're like, okay, that's done. You send it to the editor, and then will do it again. It comes back again, every page marked up again. And it's like, I just did this, the same. He'll mark everything again, the same stuff. I said, I already didn't want to do this. And finally the book, you're finally done, and then the copy editor goes through it, and a copy editor again makes little edits, comma here, like, can we split this? This is an awfully long sentence, and it's like, oh my God, I got to do this again. And then the book comes out, and after all of that, there's still like 5 typos. It's like, how is this possible? How are there typos? That doesn't make any sense, Right. It was a little more graceful with my second book because I've got a different editor, and we're working together much better than with this particular book. But
that book is coming out in March. It's called
March.
The Animals.
Yeah.
It's really good.
And I'll show you what it looks like. So at some point, they'll send you one of these. This is a ARC, an Advanced Reader's Copy, a galley, and it's like a cheaply printed version. And this is what goes out to the New York Times and the reviewers and blurbers and people who blurb. Those are the quotes that go on the back, the blurbs. And this will come out. And this is one of the versions of it that you read and you mark up. And then you send a marked up version of this back to them at some point. And at that point, when you have a galley, you're getting pretty close to being done with that process.
So in the case of my book, the research part that was really important to me was actually creating the world as it was in 1993 and 94. So, like, he'll be watching football games on TV because his wealthy friend has a satellite. And those games are the games that were played on that day, and the scores are the scores. That stuff is much easier to research now than it was 10 years ago. But also there's a moment where my character he's thinking about his daughter, and he's climbed up this mountain, has walked around, and is now coming down, and there's these stairs that he comes down. And he's thinking about his daughter and how she would have counted them. And so he's counting them. And so there are 283 stairs. Well, let me tell you, there are 283 stairs because I counted them twice. So, when I was writing the book, I did go back to San Cristobal. Like, I figured out, there are some things I need to know. And so I went back and sort of looked at those very particular kinds of things. I think your process for research, so Christian does a lot of research, right? I mean, he knows nothing about math or space for that matter. But he did a lot. In this book, The Animals, that's coming out, there's a lot of, sort of topography description, all sorts of natural descriptions. And he doesn't have that background.
Yeah,
either.
I mean, in brief, because we're running out of time here. One of the things I could suggest anybody do, if you tell somebody that you're working on a book, like they'll talk to you, but people like to talk about themselves anyway, and that's what you want them to do. So when you're doing research, like part of this book takes place in Reno in the 80s, and part of it takes place in North Idaho in the 90s, and like the moment they hear you're working on a book, they want to tell you everything. Everything. Like stuff that they should not tell anybody, they will tell you, And then you make, and the important thing about that is then you make a relationship, because when you're actually writing it, then you think of the question you should have asked, and then you can call them and go like, hey, Bob, you remember me? Like, I'm writing that book. Oh, yeah. How's it going? Good. I got a little question about wolves, or whatever it is. And, oh, yeah, sure, And then you have this great research on the ground in North Idaho, which for me included like some young lady who was a research librarian who sent me 100 pages of photocopies of the newspapers from the 90s in Bonners Ferry, Idaho, like, which would have taken me all day and a bunch of money to copy, but she's just like, oh, I'm so happy to get to help somebody who's writing a book.